Imagine getting that call. You know the one where they tell you someone you love has been murdered, and then imagine getting that same call again, not even a year later, for another person you love.
Wow.
That's what happened to Corey Beavers.
It's hard to fathom that kind of grief and loss.
Right. And on top of that, both deaths are surrounded by all this mystery. And that's what we're diving into today, the deaths of Gallery Brazad and Cody Beavers. You shared some really interesting stuff with us about this case. Like we've got pieces of the Motive for Murder podcast and some personal accounts from Corey and his mother, Shirley.
Yeah.
And we even have the 911 call that Cody's wife, Nazarene, made when she found his body.
Right, and each one of those pieces gives us a different angle on this whole tragic puzzle. So as we look at those together, maybe we can start to, untangle these events that, that changed Corey's life forever.
Okay, so let's start with Gallery's murder. It was back in January of 2012, and her relationship with Corey was, they were just sort of starting to fall in love.
Oh.
Can you imagine? I mean, falling in love and then having it taken away like that so brutally.
I can't. And the impact on Corey, it's just unimaginable. Not only is he grieving Gallery's loss, but he's also right in the middle of this homicide investigation.
And what's really frustrating, at least from what Corey says, is that he felt like the Houston PD, the ones investigating Gallery's murder, that they just weren't making any progress. He even felt like they weren't taking him seriously, and that just made his pain even worse.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, I can only imagine losing someone you love and then feeling like the cops that they're not doing everything they can to catch whoever did it.
Right. And sadly, Corey's nightmare didn't end there. Just 10 months later, tragedy struck again. And this time, it hit even closer to home. In November 2012, his identical twin brother, Cody, was murdered in his own apartment.
Wow. 10 months apart. 2 murders, both connected to Corey. It's chilling. And you can't help but wonder, are these tragedies, are they somehow linked?
It really makes you wonder. And that question gets even more unsettling when you hear that 911 call from Nazarene, Cody's wife. Just a warning, though, it's tough to listen to. Hearing her terror, her disbelief as she finds her husband's body, it's really disturbing.
That recording, it's like this raw reminder of all the chaos and trauma that surrounded Cody's death. It takes you right back to that awful moment. And it really sets the stage for the investigation that's about to get wrapped up in all this mystery.
And that's where Sergeant Doucet with the Harris County Sheriff's Office comes in. He was the lead on Cody's case. And what he saw at the crime scene, it reveals some pretty interesting details.
Yeah, like one of the first things Sergeant Doucet noticed was the blood. It was already dry, which meant that Cody had probably been dead for hours, and there was this smell indicating that, that he'd been dead for a while.
So right away, the investigators had a possible time frame for the murder sometime in the early morning. And then, as they kept looking around the apartment, they found more clues that suggested this wasn't just some random act of violence. It looked more like a planned attack.
Yeah, one thing that stood out was the closet door near the front door. It was open, just a crack, like maybe someone was hiding in there waiting for Cody to come back.
Wow, that's chilling to think about. Someone lurking in the shadows, waiting to attack. It makes you think this was premeditated. And it makes you wonder if the killer knew Cody's routine.
Yeah, and that question gets even bigger when you factor in what Nazarene told Sergeant Doucet about that morning. She said that Cody walked her to her car every morning. It was their routine. And since she had the only key, they never bothered to lock the door.
So the killer, if they were waiting inside, they would have known that the apartment would be unlocked, that Cody would be coming back alone.
Exactly. It adds another layer to this, this whole chilling calculation to this case.
But I think the most unsettling detail has got to be Cody's wedding ring. It wasn't on his ring finger. It was on his middle finger.
Now, that's strange. That really threw up some red flags for the investigators. Was it random? Did the killer do that on purpose? Was it, some kind of message, a symbol, or just a morbid afterthought?
And to make things even weirder, there was no sign of a robbery. Nothing valuable was missing, so it doesn't look like it was about money, which just makes it seem even more likely that Cody's murder was personal, maybe even targeted.
Right. And then the focus shifted to Nazarene. I mean, she's the grieving widow, obviously distraught, but she also had a gun when Sergeant Doucet got there. And that's going to raise some questions.
Yeah. Was she involved somehow? Or was she truly just a victim in all this?
Yeah.
It's a really tough question, especially given how much she was going through emotionally.
Absolutely. And before we jump to any conclusions, we got to look at all the possibilities. Remember that neighbor who said they saw someone suspicious asking about Cody's apartment a few days before the murder?
Right. That mysterious person, they add another layer to this already complicated puzzle. Someone was definitely interested in Cody before he died, but who was it?
Right. The witness couldn't give a very good description, but they worked with a police sketch artist, hoping to create, an image that might spark someone's memory or help identify the person.
It's like we're putting together a huge puzzle, but there are some key pieces missing. Were Gallery's and Cody's murders connected? Was Corey the real target all along? And what about this mysterious person snooping around Cody's apartment?
So many questions. Those are the questions that really start to eat away at the investigators. And frankly, they eat away at us too as we try to understand this case. We have to weigh the evidence and consider all the different perspectives. We can't jump to conclusions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not some neat and tidy story with easy answers.
Yeah.
This is a jumbled mess of human emotions, maybe mixed with some ulterior motives, and the very real chance that the truth is even crazier than we can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
It leaves us wondering, is Nazarene a victim? Is she hiding something? Or is it something else entirely? Yeah, good questions. And in part 2, we're going to dig into the FBI investigation, hear more of Nazarene's story, and look into the search for the killer who might have been hiding in plain sight. So get ready for some twists and turns, because this case, it's far from over. So we were talking about Nazarene Ursan, Cody's widow, and how she's right at the center of all this. Remember, she just told Sergeant Doucet everything about her last morning with Cody, like how he walked her to her car and they didn't lock the door.
Yeah.
But then her story takes this really wild turn. I mean, she tells Sergeant Doucet something that sounds almost too crazy to be true.
Okay, what is it? What'd she say? She says that before she met Cody and moved to Houston, she was actually she was held captive by a stalker. This guy was obsessed with her, wouldn't let her go.
Whoa, a stalker.
Mm-hmm.
So now we've got a possible double homicide and a whole stalker situation. This is getting pretty intense.
It really is. And this is where the investigators got to be super careful, right? I mean, is Nazarene telling the truth? Is this stalker a real person, or is this, something she made up? It's hard to know for sure, especially right after a traumatic event like Cody's murder. Trauma can really mess with your memory, with how you see things.
Okay, so let's break this down a little. What exactly did Nazarene tell Sergeant Doucet about this stalker? Did she give any details?
Oh, yeah, she did. She said this guy had been following her for months, that he broke into her apartment, stole her stuff, even threatened to kill her. She described him as, controlling, manipulative, totally fixated on her. She basically described someone who was dangerously obsessed.
Man, that does sound like a movie. But how'd she get away from him? And why would he suddenly show up in Houston years later? That doesn't really make sense.
Well, she told Sergeant Doucet that she managed to climb out her apartment window in the middle of the night and escape. Then she took off to Texas, hoping to, start over, leave that whole nightmare behind. But she always had this fear that he'd find her.
So she's saying that this stalker tracked her down, found out about Cody, and killed him out of, jealousy or anger. Is that what she's saying?
That's the story she told. But it's important to remember that it's just that. A story. A very dramatic one, but still just a story. The investigators need to back up her claims, find some proof, and that's tough. They need something concrete to link this supposed stalker to Cody's murder.
I'm guessing that's when the FBI gets involved, because now we're talking about interstate stalking, maybe even murder across state lines. This is getting really serious.
Exactly. The FBI comes in with way more resources, more expertise. They've got the people and the reach to really dig into Nazarene's past, interview people from her old life, see if her story checks out. They're looking for anything that can either prove or disprove her claims.
Yeah, this is getting really complicated. 2 murders, a grieving widow who says she was stalked, a possible suspect on the loose, and now the FBI is involved. I mean, where do we even start to make sense of all this? It feels like we're going in circles.
It's a real challenge for the investigators and for us trying to understand this case too. We have to weigh the evidence, see things from different angles, and not jump to conclusions. It's a fine line between, being skeptical and being understanding.
I get it. But that's what makes this whole deep dive so gripping, right? It's not some simple story with easy answers. It's this tangled mess of emotions, maybe some hidden motives, and the possibility that the truth is stranger than fiction. It makes you wonder, is Nazarene the victim, or is she manipulating things, or is there even more to it than that?
Yeah, and those are just some of the questions we're going to try to answer as we get into the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the FBI's investigation, unpack Nazarene's whole story, and see how the search for the killer, who might have been hiding in plain sight this whole time, unfolds. So be ready for some twists and turns because this is far from over.
Last we left off, the FBI was stepping in, right? Bringing all their resources and expertise to this case that just seems to get more complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
And it seemed like Nazarene's story, the one about the stalker, well, it seemed like it might be the missing piece, like it could explain why Cody was killed. But investigations, well, they rarely go in a straight line.
True. And in this case, as the FBI started looking into Nazarene's past, some things just weren't adding up. Like small details were off, timelines got fuzzy, and they started to wonder if her stalker story was really true.
Yeah, it's a tough spot, isn't it? I mean, they have to take her seriously, right?
Yeah.
She could be a victim who just went through something horrible.
Absolutely. You can't just ignore someone's fears, their experiences, especially not in a situation as sensitive as this one. But on the other hand, the investigators got to be thorough. They got to double check everything, especially when there's a murder involved.
And as the FBI dug deeper, they found something really surprising. Some of the people that Nazarene said could back up her stalker story, well, they just didn't exist. Records didn't match up, and her story started to fall apart.
It's like you pull on one loose thread and the whole thing unravels. It makes you question everything you thought you knew. So if there was no stalker, then what happened? And what does that mean for Cody's murder investigation?
This is where things take a big turn.
Hmm.
The focus goes back to Nazarene, and the investigators start thinking about her, as a possible suspect. I
Right.
mean, she had a gun that night, and her stalker story wasn't really holding up.
It's tough to think about, especially after hearing her tell her story, all the fear in her voice on that 911 call. But the evidence is pointing in a different direction now.
So, are they saying that maybe Nazarene killed Cody herself? But why? I mean, it sounded like they had a good relationship.
That's the big question, right? The motive. It's often the key to figuring out a murder, and in this case, it's a real mystery. The investigators look into all sorts of angles, like money, maybe an affair, a sudden outburst of anger, anything that might explain why she would want Cody dead.
But as we've seen in this deep dive, the answers aren't always easy. People are complicated. Sometimes, no matter how hard you investigate, the truth just stays hidden.
That's the hard part about this case. Even after all the work by the local police and the FBI, neither Gallery's nor Cody's murder has been solved. We're left with all these questions hanging in the air.
It's a frustrating and heartbreaking ending, really. Was Nazarene's stalker real, or was it all a lie to cover something up? Did she have something to do with Cody's death? And what about Gallery? Was it connected, or was it just a terrible coincidence?
Yeah. And those questions, they continue to haunt Corey Beavers and the families of the victims. And while we may never know the whole truth, what we can do is remember Gallery and Cody and hope that someday justice will be served.
This deep dive, it's taken us on a wild ride, hasn't it? We've seen the devastating effects of loss, learned about how police investigations work, and even considered the possibility that the truth might be right there in front of us, but hidden.
Yeah, it has. But I think the biggest takeaway is that even when faced with tragedy and unanswered questions, we gotta keep searching for truth and justice.
We might never know all the answers in this case, but I think exploring it together, looking at the evidence and hearing the stories, it reminds us how complex life is and how strong the human spirit can be. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into this truly puzzling and heartbreaking case.